Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this conversation series, Stories of Creative Courage. I am delighted to have today the author Emily Midorikawa, and I will introduce Emily in a moment because I know we're going to have a great conversation about all of the writing that she's done, about her forthcoming novel that's about to hit the shelves very soon this month, and just to talk about creativity generally, including what gets in the way, how can we harness our courage in order to express ourselves with more wholeness and in our full expression. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. The reason that I sort of began this conversation series really is because, my particular definition of creative courage is when we bring all of ourselves to our creative endeavors, including things like resistance and fear. Resistance can take on lots of sneaky disguises, I feel. And when we don't acknowledge that to ourselves and with each other, it's so much more difficult, I think, to create anything, whether that's a book that you're writing or a painting that you're making, or indeed creating a creative life, or a creative project or a business. So I'm very much about, bringing the unseen forward. And I really firmly believe that we can't do it alone. It's always better when we can have these conversations and bring these things to light and acknowledge and support and witness each other. And so that's really the kind of rationale behind why I started having these conversations with a whole range of people. I think this is episode 18 or something, and there's an endless variation of conversations we could have, and so that's really the kind of thinking behind it. And so welcome to Mac and to Autumn, who are joining us live. Great to have you with us, and I'm really looking forward to diving in. If you have questions and comments, please feel free to post them, and we can kind of pick up the thread of those as we go. But now over to my guest for today. Emily Midorikawa, who's an author, as I said, and Emily's been writing a long time, I know, and so I'd love to dig in to talk about that and just trace a little bit of the trajectory of your writing career, Emily. So you've written non-fiction, including group biographies of women who are making an impact in the world. And I really see that as a thread in your work, that you're very interested in kind of female empowerment. And, your book, Out of the Shadows, was very much, about that. And then also a book about friendship that you wrote collaboratively with your friend and colleague, Emma. And we can maybe talk about that as well. Like, what's the difference between writing alone and writing collaboratively? But what's most exciting is that your debut novel is coming out. I think it's the 23rd of July, is that right?
That's correct, yes. Thank you, Rachel.
Quite soon, and it's coming out with a publisher called Manila Press, and you're doing a kind of book tour. And so, there's lots that we can talk about. But remind us of the name of the novel, and also I would love to know where the title came from, because it's got such a cool title.
So yes, the novel is called A Tiny Speck of Black and Then Nothing. The novel has actually had a number of different titles. I think it can be quite hard to find the right one. But when I had a title that wasn't really quite working, I was on the lookout for another title. It was just quite hard to think of one. So this was quite a number of years ago. I reread the manuscript, just kind of looking if there was any sort of ideas, themes, anything in the novel that kind of stood out to me that might work as a sort of jumping off point for a title. And then I just noticed there was this line in it, a tiny speck of black. It was actually a tiny speck of black, then nothing. And it was, it was describing a character in the novel sort of disappearing. But I thought, actually, that really sums up many of the things. It was supposed to be just, this one line, but I felt it actually summed up really many of the things that the novel was about. So it just kind of came out of the text itself.
Oh, amazing. I love it as a title. I think it's very arresting. I can really see it on the shelf. And I personally would go and pick up that novel because of the title. I think it's so intriguing.
Oh, thank you.
Poetic as well. So so welcome. It's just really wonderful to have you here as a guest. We've known each other quite a while. I think we met at a writers' conference, maybe even I don't know, 15 years ago, something like that, in the UK. But you're now based in Washington, DC. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So I think my memory is actually that I went to my friend Emma's house. Emma Claire Sweeney, who I wrote A Secret Sisterhood, my book on literary friendship. I wrote that book with her. And I think, if memory serves correct, she had a copy of Sister Wives, your book, Rachel, in her house. And I picked it up and said, oh, this looks interesting. And I went off and read it. And I think that was the first time I really came across you. But then, yes, subsequently we met at that conference, and it was really nice to meet you in person.
Oh, fantastic. I didn't know that. And I honestly, everyone's watching. I didn't prime that. But no, that's great. And I think there's this connection that's long-standing. And so, yeah, it's been really wonderful to see as well the evolution of your literary career, like over the years since you started writing. So lots to dive into. The first question I always ask is really a broad one about creativity generally. And it's really like, how does creativity show up for you in your life?
Yeah, so I think there are lots and lots of different ways of being creative. And I think actually that almost everybody has some kind of urge to be creative. And sometimes that's in quite an obvious way. And sometimes it might be in a more subtle way. So, people can be very creative, even if they don't consider themselves to have a particularly creative life, maybe they're very creative through their cooking, the meals they make, or, perhaps they have a real interest in gardening, and that's how their creativity comes out. There are many, many ways that I think you can be creative. I guess in my case, being a writer, there's sort of a bit more of a kind of, obvious intention behind it. And I mean, writing has always just been really important to me. Even as a small child, I was always scribbling stories. I'd make these little books out of bits of paper, and, I'd had high hopes that these little scraps of paper might be published one day. Obviously, that was a very unrealistic dream, but I suppose it planted an idea in my head that writing a book was possible. So yeah, I guess, writing is obviously my main creative thing, and as I've gone on with my career, it started to take over all other aspects, really, or maybe not all other aspects, but many, many other aspects of my creative life. Pushing out other things, I think, but perhaps I'll take them up at some point later in life.
So writing is a kind of practice as well as, your main kind of creative expression. So tell us like how you came to start writing then. So obviously, writing as a child, but then as often we grow up, don't we? And we maybe write, little stories as children, and that has a kind of free and full expression that's sort of unencumbered lots of the time. We don't get kind of writer's block as children, if that's what we're inclined to do. We're just expressing ourselves. But I'm curious about your journey, from being an adult, and how then you started to write when you were older, if that makes sense.
Yes, so I'd kind of, written creatively through childhood into my teenage years. I'm not saying this stuff was any good, but I was at least kind of keeping going with it. After university, I ended up living in Japan for a couple of years. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with my life, and I'm half Japanese, half British. And so, it was, I had a feeling that I would like to go and explore Japan more. So I got a job teaching English in Japan. And that job was, it was a great job in many ways, because it was interesting. It was very interesting in being in Japan. I wouldn't say I was overloaded with work duties. So I had quite a lot of free time. I never really had any work to take home. I had quite a lot of free time, to be honest, during my working day. So it provided this very, this great environment for, trying to write a bit more seriously. So while I was in Japan, I kept a diary. I started to just jot down little things that interested me, and I ended up with kind of notebooks full of sketches of things that I'd noticed, character descriptions, and eventually, I guess what was originally a series of non-fiction pieces started to come together, and I started to get the idea for a novel. I was also very lucky while I was in Japan that not only did I have this great environment for getting going as a writer, a lot of time on my own, a lot of free time, I was also very lucky to meet Emma, who I mentioned before. So Emma at the time was another English language teacher who also had an ambition to be a published writer. And this was really the first person I'd ever met who shared this ambition to become a published novelist, really. And it took us a while to admit to each other that we had this ambition, because at the time I think we both felt it was quite an audacious thing to want. Neither of us really knew lots of published novelists, neither of us had any idea to go about this. But once we had kind of admitted this to each other, we realized that we did have this one thing, which was, a friend that had similar desires, a friend who was in the same position. And I think we recognized quite early that by supporting each other in all sorts of different ways, through practical support, letting each other know about writing competitions or grants or, opportunities that were coming up, and also being ready to critique each other's work, we could kind of help each other to make this, what seemed like it's quite arduous journey to publication together.
I love that. It's like the perfect conditions, isn't it, for writing? So you had time on your hands. Sounds like the dream. You've got a job, you've got an income, you've got time at work to be able to write and to jot down ideas. You're in a different location as well, so you're away from home. I think that can often be really productive, fertile kind of condition. And then you've got a friendship as well, a creative, collaborative friendship. So I love all of that. And I'd love to hear a bit more, I suppose, about your writing collaboration with Emma. So on the book about literary friendship, you were actually in a literary friendship and then writing about the literary friendship of others. So talk us through like the process, like what did writing and producing that book collaboratively give you that perhaps writing alone didn't give you or doesn't give you?
So I think when you work on a joint project with somebody, you obviously have to pick the right person. And just because somebody is a great friend, and Emma is a great friend of mine, that doesn't necessarily mean that that'll be the right person to work on a creative project with, because, I think both of you have to have a similar idea about the general direction of the project. I think you both have to be as invested as each other in it. I don't think these things tend to work, unless there's a very obvious agreement at the beginning that one person will be the senior partner and one person will be kind of more junior. I think you do really need to work out right at the start off that you're on sort of the same page. I think we felt relatively confident about that, even at the stage when we were pitching the book as a proposal, because we had done quite a bit of writing together. We had run a literary blog called somethingrhyme.com. And on that blog, we would profile usually a historical friendship between two female writers. We would do this on a monthly basis. And we also interviewed modern day writers and, did various other pieces of related writing. But the focus each month was usually a historical pair. So we'd worked on that for, I think, at least a year. Doing these regular posts on a weekly basis before we decided to pitch the proposal for the book. We'd also written like feature articles together. So I think we felt like we would, we would work fairly well together. And once we actually got going on the process, I'm not saying there were no moments of tension, because I think that's almost impossible. But I think, broadly looking back, we worked well together. Sometimes, when you're working with someone, there is that element of negotiation that needs to, if one of you thinks this is the way this section of the book should go, if one of you thinks you should write this sentence this way, you do have to find a way of agreeing with each other. And I suppose, when things were at their most sort of fraught, as it were, sometimes I would find myself thinking, this would be so much easier if I was on my own. And I have no doubt Emma felt exactly the same. But as soon as I wasn't working with Emma on my next book, I really missed her. It's so great to be working on a project where there's someone else that feels as strongly as you do about it, someone who's always ready to bounce back, bounce ideas across with each other. It really was a wonderful experience working with Emma, and in some ways a slightly, well, maybe not a unique experience, but one that not all writers get to experience. So I feel very lucky to have done that.
Yeah, that's amazing to have found that ease of collaboration, that you both have kind of similar principles and ideas about the things, and notwithstanding there's inevitably going to be a tussle, because it's the sum of both of your processes in a way. And I'm always curious, I'm fascinated, to kind of talk to writers who do collaborate about how they do that. So some people would sort of take turns and write different chapters. I've actually written collaboratively where we've sat down next to each other and literally hammered out every single sentence together, which is like, a much longer, more torturous process as well. But, I love what you're saying, that, you kind of notice the difference like afterwards, that when you come to write on your own, there's this something, and there's something, isn't there, or can be, I think, a sort of lightening of the process when you're in it together, and I know that from my own kind of drama collaborations. I've kind of had plays staged and audio drama, working with directors, producers, actors, it kind of widens the project much more, so that I feel that's helpful, because it's not just about me. And so where resistance comes up, it's like there's a partner in the process, which I personally find really helpful. So I was curious about that. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So I'd love to move on to talk about the novel, because this has been, I know, a long time coming. So I believe that your novel, A Tiny Speck of Black and Then Nothing, you started writing it in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And then it's coming out this year. So that's like, what, 22-ish years, something like that in the making? Fascinating. Like, tell us all about that and how that came to be. Like, what's the life story of this novel?
Okay, so I should start by saying I haven't been working on it for the entirety of this 22 years, but I did indeed start it in the 2000s. So when I was talking about my time in Japan, and I was saying, eventually these like little bit scraps of writing started to come together as, something like a novel. And this is the novel that I'm talking about. It was obviously very, very different then, but the bare bones of the plot are still there. The basic storyline remains as it was, even though there's been lots and lots of changes since then. So I began writing it when I was in Japan. I was very, very inexperienced as a writer at the time. And I think when I was initially working on it, it wasn't just a case of learning how to write that novel, but it was a case of learning how to write any novel. I just dived in, full of confidence and enthusiasm, which is great. But, I think at a certain point you kind of, for a lot of people, you can hit a brick wall with that. Sometimes I think, a writer can get lucky and they can just sort of storm ahead with that. But I feel like I made lots of, missteps and had to kind of go back and redo things. But I learned a lot from that. So, anyway, I worked on the novel for several years before I felt it was ready to start submitting to agents. I did an MA course at UEA, which helped me greatly. And I did have a bit of interest from some agents after that. But I continued to work on the novel, and eventually an agent did take it on. And I, in my mind, I think I felt when I got an agent, and this was still quite a long time ago, I felt like, right, I'm almost there. But then this turned out to be kind of a convoluted process as well. Like, the agent was very committed to the book and we spent a lot of time revising it. It went out on submission to publishers, and we had, quite a bit of interest, but it just didn't quite, get there. And then we started revising it a bit more and, trying to, see if I could make, the story more, compelling to editors. And, I just, persisted with this, and my agent continued to send it out, and it just didn't work out. It got very close on several occasions, but just didn't, things never quite lined up. We never managed to get the book actually on its way to coming out in print. And eventually, I think I just felt, and obviously my agent felt as well, that, it was time to draw a line on this and to try and move on. Following, this whole, episode, which we've gone on for a very long time, I started to send out the book. When I saw a competition for unpublished writers that I thought it would fit with, I would send it out to those. And, sometimes I would find some success with that. I had some success with a few different literary competitions, including the Lucy Cavendish Fiction Prize. I actually won that in 2015. Again, I thought this might be the opportunity for the book to come, but it just didn't work out. So then I decided that book just needed to go into a bottom drawer. I had learned a lot from it. I still felt very kind of close to it in a way, but I could not spend my whole life rewriting this book. And by then, my literary friendship blog, somethingrhyme.com, that I was running with Emma, had started to gain quite a bit of popularity. And we started to think, and some of our readers had started to suggest that there might be a book, loosely based on this. So that's when we started to pitch ideas for a secret sisterhood. A secret sisterhood isn't like a transfer of the blog to the page. It's a much more in-depth study of literary friendship, looking specifically at the friendships of Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, and Virginia Woolf. But it certainly grew out of the blog. So I wrote the book with Emma. Then I went on to write another nonfiction book that you mentioned before, the one about Victorian spiritualists, Out of the Shadows. And after that, I really felt a pull to return to writing fiction. So I had begun another book, a different book, a historical novel. And I was, finding my way with that. And then one day in 2024, so 2 years ago, I got a really unexpected email from my agent to say that an editor who had read the book quite some time ago had got in touch again and wanted to know if it was still available. And I was shocked because I had very much given up on that book. And I said, it is still available and you're welcome to show it to her again. But to be honest, having had so many kind of letdowns and so many kind of, almost there moments with it in the past, I thought this would be another one of those. And then to my immense amazement, an offer came through to publish it. So then it was a case of having to kind of dive back into this book that I hadn't looked at for about a decade. Obviously I was thrilled that somebody wanted to take it on. I was also a little bit nervous at facing the manuscript again because I felt that I had improved as a writer since then. I had this quite deep fear that what I looked at might be quite terrible. And I'm not saying that when I went and looked at it, there weren't lines that made me cringe and that I thought, I've just got to redo those. There definitely were things I thought my inexperience really showed. But I was pleasantly surprised that, the basic structure of the book seemed to work and that I still felt involved enough with the characters and the story that I felt I could go through, the process of revising the book to get it ready for publication.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, very inspiring as well. I often think that books, they have their own composting time or that their own time, and I imagine if you had been successful earlier, then it would have been a very different book, so that by the time you come back to it, you've matured as a writer, you've got all of that experience, you're able to go back and really revise it with all of that experience in mind. So I think that's really inspiring. And
it did actually slightly change the text itself as well, because at the time I was writing in very kind of contemporary times when I first began it. And I realized when I went back to it, this has actually become a work of, recent historical fiction almost, and more than that, I kept the narrator is young through most of the book. That's how she sort of presents. But there's also a bit at the beginning and the end of the book where the narrator is looking back on her life, looking back down the years. And, that voice, looking back with a more distant perspective comes into the book on a few occasions. And obviously that wouldn't have been there if the book hadn't, sat for so many years on my computer or in this metaphorical bottom drawer.
Absolutely. So there's like a deepening of texture somehow that's happened over the course of that. I'd love to know more about the book in a moment. I'd love you to kind of tell us a little bit more about it. And I'll post the link as well to the publisher in the show notes when I write this up. But there's something that's here for me around, having faith in this story that came to you in the early 2000s. And then, I think I read somewhere that you'd completely given up hope that it would kind of see the light of day. And then, it is kind of it's a beautiful coincidental thing that the editor got in touch. But there's something there for me in your resilience of like keeping going in a way, like your faith in this project. And I'm wondering if you can say something about that and, whether that is true,
Yeah, so I suppose on some level, I did have confidence in the project because I guess when, it wasn't being picked up by editors and it was sort of a bit on hold, I did keep sending it out to literary competitions. So I think, I must have felt there was something about it, that even though there seemed to be no deal on the table, like that there might be something that some readers might like about it. But there were definitely moments when I felt like I had invested an awful lot of time in a project that, in material terms at least, wasn't, it hadn't amounted to anything. Yes, I could always say, I learned a lot from experience, and I built on that, and I used it to write other books, and that is definitely true. But I think when we set out to write a book, our hope is always that we will complete the book and that other people will get to read it. And so, there is kind of that disappointment there. But I think I was lucky that I had some faith in the book, sometimes more than others, but I had other people in my life who had faith in me as a writer. And also, I guess, in that particular book, like my agent always believed that had been a book that was, compelling to her and had been worth writing. And Emma was someone who believed in that book. Really, I don't know why, but she had always said that she believed that book would be published one day. And this was in a period when I felt, all hope was really lost on that. So I did always kind of, retain, a sense of the fact that she liked it so much. That was very, very important to me. It's very encouraging in those most difficult times.
Yeah, beautiful. Again, kind of the strength in numbers, kind of having creative companions, creative friends who can support and mirror back and reflect back what we can't always see, or, kind of fan the flames of the faith that's there as well. Like that's a beautiful, it's a beautiful kind of place to be, I think. So I'd love you to tell us about the book and, a summary of the story, like what is it about and what are the kind of key themes, and what was the driver for you in writing this novel?
So the novel is set in the Japanese city of Osaka in the early 2000s, and it's about a young English language teacher and her very intense friendship with a young nightclub hostess, and it's about what happens when one of them, the hostess, suddenly disappears. So I guess it's a work of literary fiction, but I guess it also draws on traditions of suspense fiction, classic crime fiction, classic noir in particular. And it's also a book. Initially, when I first started drafting it, maybe this wasn't so prevalent, but it's also the main character, the English language teacher, is of mixed Japanese and British heritage, like me. It's not based on me, but there are obviously like some similarities here. And it's also about an exploration of a character, I guess, their cultural identity as it's kind of important to them, and how that changes perhaps when they move from one location, the country that they were born in, to another location, the country that's sort of part of their cultural heritage.
Amazing. I love that there's a kind of crime noir element in it, the kind of mystery of that and the suspense of that. I've pre-ordered it.
Thank you very much. That's very kind.
No, I can't wait to read it. And so it's out on the 23rd of July. So I will put the link in case people are, going to want to get their hands on it as well. I guess I'm curious as well about how your novel sits alongside the other things that you've written as well, because I think there are kind of recurring patterns and motifs that often as writers or any creatives in general, we keep returning sometimes to the same issues, problems, challenges, ideas, themes. So I just wonder if you can kind of give us a little bit of a sense of like what it is for you that really pulls you to write, and what are you interested in and passionate about in these different projects that you've done?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I mean, in a sense, all of these books are, based on things that I was interested in and I was drawn to, and so they all kind of come from me. But when the offer came through, to publish this novel, I did kind of look at the two books that I'd done before and think, yeah, to me, obviously, there's a connection because I understand that I wrote all of them and I was interested in all these subjects. But I was thinking, readers are not going to see any kind of connection between these books. I did this group biography on Austen, Bronte and Eliot and Woolf. And then I did another group biography, which was about different women, but it was about a vaguely similar time period. Some of the themes were quite similar. Even the inspiration for Out of the Shadows, in a way, came out of A Secret Sisterhood, because there was a letter that I was reading when I was researching A Secret Sisterhood that, it had no particular relevance to A Secret Sisterhood. I just kind of stumbled on it, but I thought, oh, that's interesting. When I finish this book, I might return to that letter and just see if there's anything there. And that kind of sparked, my thought that I wanted to do more research. So there, in a way, Out of the Shadows kind of grew directly out of A Secret Sisterhood. And then, I thought, I'm returning to this other book, and I'm just not sure, like, readers will see kind of any kind of connection. But actually, the more that I worked on A Tiny Speck of Black and then Nothing, I realised actually there were lots of connections. The theme of friendship, for instance, a very important one. A friendship is very central to the main storyline of A Tiny Speck of Black and then Nothing. I'd written this whole book about literary friendship, but essentially about friendship. And also, I guess, this idea of women trying to find their way in the world. That's something that, in a world that's not always necessarily welcome to, giving them a voice or giving them a space, I guess, is the theme that crops up in all of those books. So, yeah, the more I worked on the novel, I realised, I guess I was interested in these sorts of themes that I explored in my nonfiction. I was already interested in them many, many years ago, but it wasn't, there on the surface. I wouldn't have necessarily have consciously felt that these were sort of key themes for me. But looking back now, I feel like, yes, that was very much there from the start.
Yeah, so interesting. I think I have a similar thing. I can kind of look all the way back, right back to my PhD thesis, actually, and kind of see some of the same themes that are there across different forms of writing. And, it's almost like I'm obsessed with the same things, and I just keep writing them in different ways. And so it's so interesting, I think, to make the connections between fiction and non-fiction, for example. And then we're not kind of boxed into, novelist, that actually writing can be much broader than that there can be a breadth to it as well. So I'd love to kind of come to what gets in the way of creativity for you, Emily. I'm very interested in, kind of what are the things, what are the ways that resistance shows up for people when they're engaged in a creative project? So what for you gets in the way?
Well, I think sometimes the things that get in the way, they can sometimes be like two sides of the same coin. So sometimes things that are maybe wonderful of themselves and maybe actually do have some kind of creative benefit, at least in the short term, are things that also get in the way of, your creative project that you're working on at that moment. So, I'm sure a lot of people feel like finding that balance between paid work and your creative work. And if you're lucky enough to, your creative work is your only paid work. But, I think most people are juggling things a bit. So I'm quite lucky in a way, because for a number of years, my paid work has been quite closely related to, my writing. So I taught writing in universities for many years, and I still do, occasional online mentoring or, manuscript appraisals. So, every time you advise somebody on their book, there is always something you can take from that, just even trying to clarify to somebody how to do something. Often it will actually kind of fine tune something that was sort of bubbling away in the back of your mind, but you hadn't really sort of, quite got to the heart of what it was really about. So it can be very helpful in that way. But having said that, even though there's often an indirect benefit creatively, you can, I think particularly if you're working on a freelance basis, end up taking on too much and then finding that every day you're just helping other people with their writing, which can be great, but not always so much if it's totally at the detriment, of your own work. So it's finding that balance.
Yeah, absolutely. And then internally, are there any kind of internal obstacles, like, things around fear, resistance, like procrastination? These are often common things that, people watching this conversation and who I work with and who read my Substack, kind of are, they experience that on a regular basis. So I wonder if, are you free from that, or when does that show up for you, if at all? Like, and how do you tackle that?
Yeah, I'm definitely not free from any of those things. I guess now, because I have two small children, I have sort of learnt to just try and get down to things when I do have free time. I probably do procrastinate less because I feel like time is so precious. But certainly, yeah, of course, and there still are days when I do procrastinate. But particularly sort of in the past, I think the thing that actually would sometimes get in my way was, the fear that what I was writing wasn't good enough, and I could sometimes find it hard to push on. If you decide to write a novel, one of the things you have to do is just generate a lot of words. It's not like writing a poem, which is also challenging, but you're usually confined to 1 or 2 pages maybe. One of the things you have to do if you want to write a novel, as opposed to other kinds of creative writing, you have to generate a lot of words. And sometimes in the early days, I would get so hung up on trying to make this paragraph absolutely perfect that I could spend days and days and days on this. And eventually, when the story moved on, I'd realised that, great as that paragraph was, it didn't actually fit with the storyline anymore. So it had to kind of be scrapped anyway. And I would feel like, I could have maybe just pushed on. I think it can be hard as a writer, and probably other kinds of artists as well, to know when you need to really stop and polish and really hone something and give yourself the time. And when there are those moments when you have to kind of accept this isn't perfect yet, and it probably won't ever be perfect, but it can be better. But I need to push on and see what I can do. And initially, I always found that quite difficult.
Yeah, I can really relate to that. That's exactly been my process as well. I feel as I've evolved, in all the ways creatively and in all the kind of different kinds of creative expression. It's about embracing mess, if that makes sense. Like, oh, this is okay, this is a messy, good enough kind of version for now. And especially with something long form like a novel, like, yeah, it can take years. So there's no point polishing that, paragraph when, like you say, it might be deleted anyway and it might not have a place, and then you've wasted all that energy and time. And certainly I also work with writers too sometimes, and kind of really put that message across. There's no point refining that sentence because it might go anyway. But I think it takes an element of understanding the full length of the process and really embracing it as a process rather than being focused on the product, which even in draft form is like, oh, it's got to be just right or whatever. I definitely learned that to my detriment when I was on an MA in creative writing, a novel writing course, and I'd spend ages polishing because I knew it was going to be scrutinized in a workshop and it had to be word perfect. And I think one of the tutors said to me, oh, you're so good at papering over the cracks. So it has this like surface polish, but then underneath, it sort of hides the kind of issues underneath. And so I feel like for me, part of my journey has been embracing that kind of imperfect and not quite good enough, and maybe not even sure where I'm going with it, but that's more real somehow, and I'm not hiding in that. And so I don't know if you can relate to that at all in terms of your own process.
Yes, I think that kind of work. So I think workshop environments can be great. I know when I first, after I came back from Japan and I was trying to write this novel, I joined like a local writers group, and it was just great to meet other people who they didn't all want to write novels, but who were doing something creative and wanted to turn up every week and show their work and share it. And then obviously I did the MA program as well, and we were doing something similar. I think those sorts of so it can be really good in terms of encouraging you. You can meet friends who have similar interests and maybe also similar literary interests, and you can continue to share work with them. There's so many great things about doing workshops. I think one of the problems, though, particularly for sort of less experienced writers, is you can end up writing really just to please that workshop group. And I guess if you are wanting to publish your work more widely, and not everyone that does, that writes wants to do that. But if you want to find a wider audience, you can't really write just to please this workshop group. And you need to use the experience of meeting with this group to help you to polish the novel or the short story or the poem as a whole, not just like this little bit that you're going to show the group today and make it perfect for this very small group of people. And I think it's when I work with students who are very, very new to creative writing, I do try and counsel against just writing to please that group of people and just gearing everything towards, getting that mark for this, particularly if they're wanting to do something longer. It's just not a strategy that's going to work long term.
Yeah, exactly. Which kind of comes back to that point about, the inner faith that one has to have with any kind of creative thing. And then, we need to be in connection with an audience or, a group of people who are going to receive the work, whatever that is, but not to not to swither, too much between kind of different types of opinion. And I think it's definitely something that needs to be developed as far as I can see. At least that's my experience as well as a writer, developing that inner confidence, that faith, whilst at the same time still being attentive to, is this connecting with the reader? Is it actually, otherwise it becomes a very navel gazing kind of activity, doesn't it? Where we're just writing to please ourselves and not, in service of the world and the entertainment or the pleasure or the knowledge of the audience or whatever. So I think it's a really difficult balance to get right in all kind of creative projects as well. Where is this mine and what's that kind of inner faith or inner listening that we have to cultivate that really makes this from us, uniquely from us and not from anyone else, and at the same time be open and attentive enough to understand how it's landing for the other people or the other person who are going to be on the receiving end of it. And that loop, I think, is really critical to get right. Yeah, wonderful. So we've talked a bit about resilience, and keeping going when, things get tough and having that inner faith. I'm wondering if you have like a definition of creative courage that served you maybe in your life. I don't know if that's a question that makes sense for you, but like how can we develop the capacity to be creative, courageous in our creativity? And what does like creative courage mean to you?
I think part of being courageous creatively is being ready to challenge yourself to do hard things. So in my case, I think one of the things that I found really daunting when I first started trying to write seriously was sharing my work in a kind of public environment. And by public, obviously, I don't mean in any kind of large public arena. I just mean, in front of other people more generally. So I think when I was doing the MA course, I used to get extremely nervous about showing my work to the group. I think partly because it was quite raw work. It was work in progress. You weren't being asked to bring in, something you'd have published in a magazine or something. You were being asked to show, something that you're working on. The whole point of the workshops was to, help you to improve this work. But I used to find this completely daunting. And I used to think, not only would I be really worried about people judging the work itself, but when I was reading it out, I would also be really worried that people would be judging my presentation of the work. I would think, they can just see I'm so nervous, my hands are shaking. I think looking back, probably I wasn't exhibiting these, physical signs of being so stressed in anything like as, an obvious way as I thought. But, it would play on my mind all the time that I was reading out. And I used to think, and everyone else here is able to do this perfectly. Of course, once I kind of slowed down a little bit and started noticing around the room, I realized lots of other people also look quite nervous. And it seemed really strange to me that they would feel nervous because they had produced work that was very good. So why did they show these signs of being nervous? And eventually I realized, we're kind of all in the same boat, and, everybody finds work showing, well, most people find showing their work daunting at first. I find sharing work much less daunting. Generally I enjoy doing events, I enjoy doing readings, but I guess it is slightly different because if I'm doing a reading, I will bring along, some published work. I'll bring along my book to read from. I won't really bring along something that I wrote that morning that still needs a lot of work. So I think, there is something particularly daunting about showing work that is unpolished, even though, you may be showing it to try and get feedback. There is a part of you, I think, that is always also showing it because you want everyone to say it's great.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's something there about we're all kind of in it together, aren't we? That, everyone has the same kind of worries and concerns and anxieties that it might not be received well. And so, yeah, we think that we're the only ones feeling this. And then actually, when we look around and realize, actually, we all share similar kind of concerns and worries about things. Yeah. So we're kind of at time. And yeah, I guess, just to say really that, you're going to be coming over to the UK. You've got a few events and readings. So, I guess it's like another level, isn't it, of creative courage that you're going to have to show in showing up and doing the readings and talking to people and answering questions. So how are you feeling?
Thankfully, I actually enjoy doing those kinds of events. I find audiences, in my experience, usually, they want to be there and they're very supportive. But more than that, after working for so long on something, you work with an editor, you work with various different people at the publishing house, you maybe workshop your work with friends before. You do spend a lot of time working on your book or, whatever creative project. You spend a lot of time working on it alone. So it's really nice to take it out into the world, read it, discuss it with people, get other people's take on it. So actually, I do end up always really enjoying those events. So I am looking forward to doing them, thankfully.
That's great. Well, we wish you well with it.
Thank you.
Excited to see kind of how the book's going to be received, and can't wait to get hold of it and read it. And in fact, I'm going to be coming to one of the launches as well in Manchester, because you're to my hometown, which I'm really happy and grateful for. So that's great. We've got a wonderful comment from Autumn saying, wonderful, inspiring conversation, and thank you. And congratulations to you on the book as well. So big congrats. Last question, which is, where can we find out about you and your work, like point us into the direction of like where we can find out more about you?
So thank you very much, Rachel. It has been wonderful having this chance to chat with you. Thank you so much for asking me to take part. If you do want to find out more about me, I have a website, emilymidorikawa.com. I'm also on Instagram at Midorikawa Emily, and also on Threads with the same tag. And I'm also on Blue Sky at Emily Midorikawa with all the Blue Sky stuff after that. I'm fairly easy to find though, because there's not very many Emily Midorikawas out there.
Yeah, it's a great name. It's a very unusual name. And I'll put the links as well in so that people can, once the show notes are up, they can kind of go and find you on your website and on Instagram as well. Emily, it's been such a pleasure to hear more and delve into the journey of your novel and to find out about your creative process and your creativity in general. So you've been a great guest. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and wish you well, and wish the book happy landing when it launches.
Thank you again, Rachel.
Yeah, great. See you soon. Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming, and see you next time.